everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Emily Sprenger. I'm an academic trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I'm very happy to have our guest speaker come back to present again for our CTL webinars. We have the president of the Bakari Historical Services, Harvey Bakari, is here today. And this session, he is going to be talking about King's Dream, Jefferson's prediction, the white veil. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Do keep in mind this is being recorded to be posted in the CTL webinar page. And for all of those who registered who might not have been able to be here at this time, they can view it at a later date. Harvey has asked if you can post any questions that you may have in the Q&A. He would like to be able to answer those as he moves into his presentation and throughout. And then, of course, the chat is open as well, too. So feel free to participate and carry on conversation. I am going to turn it over to Harvey to begin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope everybody's having a good day wherever you are. And thank you to NCU for inviting me to speak again on this series. This is a follow-up to the first presentation, King's Dream, Jefferson's Prediction, the White Veil. Now, again, I'm Harvey Bakari of Bakari Historical Services, and I believe that shifting and broadening perspectives on early African-American history and culture in America, that you can actually do that through history. So shifting perspectives is what I plan to do today. So get ready for it. I'm a speaker, a consultant, a museum professional consultant, a public historian, and a visual artist. So let me just start with telling you why this presentation may shift and broaden perspectives today, because most people began African-American history with the 19th century, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War. Most people just forget about the first 2.5 centuries. But if you eliminate the 2.5 centuries, like starting a book in the middle instead of at the beginning, it can lead to marginalization and distortions in the history. And that distortion in history can create distortions in how we see ourselves, our neighbors, our country. So I'm going to begin with the title, again, is about the white veil. You could say the color line by W.E.B. Du Bois, but I'm using the term the white veil. And I'm going to look at the origin of race in America. But I'm going to do it within a limited way. And here's pretty much an outline of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to look at race and status. Both of those were important in the 1600s as this country was being started in 1607 in Jamestown. Then we'll look at juxtapose King's and Jefferson's evolving views on race and racism. Now, this is important because sometimes with history, we will take a snapshot at one part of a person's evolution, and we won't look at the other part. So for instance, many people, if you say Martin Luther King, they may think of the Martin Luther King of 1963, where he has his I Have a Dream speech. He's lovable, he's huggable, he's the person for everyone, for America, a great speech. But did you know that just a few years later, he said that his own speech was superficial? So by 1967, Martin Luther King is a different man. He has evolved. He believes that white Americans are not committed to true equality for the Negro. He calls it vacillation, never really going far enough. Thomas Jefferson also evolves. Now we're going to take a look at more of that today, of Jefferson's evolution, of going from someone that apparently free Blacks and slaves looked up to. Now I have one indication that highly suggested, and I'm going to build that story up for you. And so that's number three. Well, I'm sorry, number three, that story is Jefferson argues before the General Court for Samuel Howe. This is why it was big news. Thomas Jefferson, 27-year-old lawyer, is arguing in the General Court at the Capitol in Williamsburg, before all the other Burges, he is trying to help a mulatto man gain his freedom. That's radical. Today, you might say, oh, radical at that time period. Now, number four, we're going to have to, before we can understand how Thomas Jefferson tries to defend this mulatto man, and you have to know that word is getting out everywhere. Before he can, I can tell you how he defended him, I have to give you some background information. Number four, the origins of whiteness and the other. So it'll be a quick background. Then we'll go to the Jefferson who's evolving during the American Revolution. When he writes the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, that's removed. It's a segment that's removed. Then we'll move on to views of Jefferson. He starts to shift now. Now he's involved in politics. And now he's shifting. And by 1781, he writes the Notes on the State of Virginia. And he talks about the inferiority of Blacks compared to whites. And we'll get to that. And then, of course, there's Benjamin Banneker. Many of you may know of Benjamin Banneker. He was a free Black man from Maryland. He was an astronomer. He made a wooden clock. He helped do there's some debate about how much planning he was involved in Washington, D.C. He didn't complete his commitment there, but he was a very bright person. And when he heard Thomas Jefferson, someone that they had high hopes in, that he now believed that Blacks were inferior, it moved Benjamin Banneker to write a personal letter to Thomas Jefferson. And then we're going to look at the end, we're going to round out with the legacies of race and its legacy, race and status. So for instance, during this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about passing for white, people of African descent, or mulattoes who are able to pass for white. But I'm going to touch on briefly the fact that has extended today. There are other minorities who are biracial, who pass for white if they find it convenient. And then lastly, something that's happening in the world of academia recently is white women passing as Black women, and particularly white women in academia and ones who are involved in like Africana studies. So we'll touch on that. If you're kind of keep up with the news, you're probably familiar with those stories. So we'll see how this represents today's, some of the activities that are happening today. So let's begin with the white veil. In order to establish who's white, you have to establish who's not. And very early on from 1600s, there's a different set of laws for Negroes, mulattoes, Indians, bond or free. And I'm using the words from that time period. So this passing, as well as this question of status, is something that happened from the 1600s to the present era. So take a look for a moment. I want you to just look at these images that are going to flash in front of you. Can you tell if these people are Black? Are they white? Suppose it's someone that you're going to hire for a job, or someone who's in a position, someone you have to answer to. Suppose it's a person of authority, or someone that you're dating. Your best guess is using your eyes, the reflection of light on a person, as well as their phenotype and features, will give you a suggestion of whether that person is white or the other. But it doesn't always work. Like for instance, here is of those pictures that you saw, there were 4 brothers in that picture, and all of them passed for white. They were from the Healy family. Michael Healy was an Irishman. He moved to the United States, started his own plantation, purchased some slaves. He took one of his enslaved women named Eliza to be his illegitimate wife. And with Elijah, he had several children. He came up with a plan because according to the law, his children with Eliza were to be slaves in Georgia. But he found an escape, if you will, for his children. As each child reached about the age of 5, they would be sent up north to a Catholic seminary where they would pass as white. So what were they able to achieve since people looked upon them and thought that they were white? At that time period, there was no DNA test. There was no genealogy as we know it today. So they have to only go off their eyesight and some public records. So what was Patrick able to do? Patrick was able to become the president of Georgetown University, something I'm sure he would not have accomplished if people knew his DNA. Alexander was a Catholic priest. James was a Catholic priest with a congregation in the state of Maine. So you can imagine what his congregations or parishioners would have thought if they knew who his mother was. And then Michael Healy was an officer in what is today the equivalent of the Coast Guard. So the eyes can't show you everything. So I'm gonna, before I go into the DNA, because today we have DNA, but I wanted to see real quick, Emily, do we have any questions before I move on?
Great time to pause. At this time, no, we don't,
Okay.
but just remember, if you do have questions, we had a few late joiners, please post any questions in the Q&A of the chat.
All right, let's now look at what you can't see when you look at people. You only see what's on the surface. You only see the sum total of that person, but you can't see all of their ancestors. So here, for example, is a DNA ancestral timeline. And actually, this is my personal timeline. And this is, I don't represent 23andMe. This is my own personal information. But what I did, I took their timeline and created a chart. And in this chart, it gives you a sense of when did certain people come into your family lineage from a specific ethnic group or ethnicity that was, for the most part, unmixed without any admixture. And you can see the Africans, but you can also see the British and the Irish. You can also see the Spanish and Portuguese, as well as the French, German, Scandinavian, Italian, further along the line. Now, this is not the gospel of DNA. It's just a suggestion. And they tell you that at 23andMe. It's a suggestion of your ancestral makeup from someone who has not mixed with other ethnicities of people. And they warn African Americans and Latinos that these are highly suggestive because those two groups tend to have more admixture. In contrast, if you are of European descent, you may have an admixture because 23andMe and most of the DNA companies were really made for Europeans, not Africans. They're working on improving that. But what you're going to see is less admixture, except amongst Europeans, but less admixture with other ethnic groups. But when you do have one, it will stand out, like this one from Angola and Congo. So I just made this one up just to give you an idea of what the sum total of your person is. It is your ancestry, all the people who are part of making you. So we're going to see how this plays a part. Now, for many African Americans, we're not surprised to find European ancestry because of slavery. It fragmented our families, it fragmented our culture. For some white Americans, finding an African or a mulatto in their family ancestry can become problematic. Sometimes before DNA and genealogy, many times the descendants of a mulatto would not tell their children that they were once mulatto. They would take that to their grave and allow their children to live as white and have the benefits of living as white in America. So the two stories, again, I'm going to start, just going to introduce those stories again. It's Samuel Howe. He's suing his master. He's the plaintiff. He's suing his master, William Netherland. Now, Samuel Howe is not a slave. He's a servant. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Well, actually, let me go ahead and start with Samuel Howe at this point. Yes. So he's a servant, not a slave. So in order for you to understand what Thomas Jefferson is trying to do, you have to understand the laws. Now, you can see from his genealogical chart, he has a Negro father, a white mother, and then they have a mulatto daughter, the mother, and then he is the son of his mulatto mother. But Jefferson is trying to help him through the courts. He's not trying to pass as white. It could be a little complicated, but I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible. But Jefferson is going to take up this case to prove that this man, who is 27 years of age, same age as Jefferson, should be free. But before we can understand that, we have to go back and understand the essence of who is not white, who is on the other side of the veil, what is their place of origin. And so that takes us to the transatlantic slave trade. Many historians will say race or racism as we know it today begins with the transatlantic slave trade because they need to justify taking Africans from Africa, bringing them to the Americas. So first, the European philosophers begin saying, well, these are inferior people. Scientists begin saying, yes, they are the lowest species. And then theologians use the Bible. If you're familiar with Genesis 9:25, the curse of Ham, the Africans are considered cursed people. So enslaving them, hopefully civilizing them, would be a benefit to the Africans. But in return, of course, Europeans would profit greatly. It would transform Europe. You see these circles on the map behind me? That represents the amount of slave ships that left from those various countries in Europe and engaged in the slave trade. So a lot of the wealth of Europe was built off of this other. You could go to London, you could take a tour, self-guided tour, look at some of the financial institutions, the Bank of London, Lords of London, Jamaica Coffee House. You can look at many of those institutions, financial institutions that profited from the transatlantic slave trade. So it's important to keep them as the other. Being the other also means you are subject to the kings, the queen. Yes, Queen Elizabeth I, merchants like Captain John Hawkins and dukes and others. You are a product, you are other for them. You are not an immigrant, you are a other. They're never described as an immigrant because an immigrant requires a person to be a human being. Africans were the other, they were not considered human beings and full, subspecies, not full human beings, but subspecies. So even the people who trafficked them, such as John Newton, many of you probably know John Newton if you sing the song Amazing Grace. But on the slave ship, on his account, he talks about the condition of the slave ship and the fact that most times the slave ships have more men and that they rarely resign themselves to that situation. So they're going to try to gain their liberty if possible. And we receive them on board from the first as enemies. So again, that gives you a sense of just how normal it was to consider Africans subhuman species. Being a Christian was not, and again, some of the things I'm telling you today, you may be troublesome, but I'm just telling you history as it was for its time period. There was no contradiction between being a Christian, owning slaves, or trafficking them across the Atlantic. It was, in its time period, a respectable business. If you saw someone that said, oh, I'm a slave ship captain, I'm a Christian, they say, oh, great. When is the next voyage? We'd like to invest more money in the next voyage. It was, the stigma had not yet changed. So let's move forward and we'll see that as David Byron Davis, historian, describes the animalization of the Africans. One way to demean them is to treat them like beasts, to try and remove their humanity as much as possible. So this is the other. So when you're white and you're on the side of the veil of whiteness, you're not this. That shows you white is other than being animalistic. All right, so that brings us to early colonial Virginia. And let me just stop right here before I go to colonial Virginia, see if there's any questions. Any questions?
Not at this time, Harvey.
Okay, so I'm going to keep rolling till
All
you
right.
guys ask. Okay, all right. Now, one thing you need to know, again, shifting perspectives, broadening perspectives. At the early settlement of the colony of Virginia and many other colonies, the labor force were interracial. Native Americans, white indentured servants, some of them voluntary, some involuntary convicts, and then by 1619, the introduction of Africans. So these people initially were working together, living together, and of course, having families together. So there was a lot of admixture. They were even intermarrying after they served their time as indentured servants and became free people. So it would not be uncommon to see a Black and white interracial marriage in the early 1600s. But eventually that changes, because one aspect of slavery in owning people is there's a sexual component to it, which is you own these quote unquote subspecies, but all of the human qualities of protecting someone from sexual abuse or rape does not apply because they are not considered full humans. So through history, many of us know about the slave owner having access to the enslaved slave owner having access to the enslaved Black woman. This is a painting from Colonial Williamsburg. It's called Virginia Luxuries. On the other side is a ambiguous painting of the slave owner, and this is the back side of the painting. So it shows you that it was more than just labor that slave owners, the relatives and friends were involved in. There was also this sexual element of owning Black bodies, whether they be men, women, boys, or girls, as well as, unfortunately, even incest. We have instances of that being recorded as well. So most historians and abolitionists, if you're a person, you're around the time, you listen to history around the time of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, the abolitionists are talking about, oh, the rape of women, the rape of the Negro women and little girls. So that's where your focus will shift to that direction. But now I'm going to shift your focus in just a moment to another direction, because first, let me tell you, I have to finish this part. They need to establish what's going to be the status of these mulatto children born between the slave owner and the enslaved woman. And so by 1662, it's hereditary slavery. The condition of the mother is the condition of the child. And fornication between Negro men and women are forbidden. Now, of course, it's not like there's a law enforcement person at every corner to stop people in the 1600s from engaging in personal interracial relationships, but that's the law if you happen to be caught. Next thing that has to be done is to ensure that you have a permanent workforce. And the reason we use the term hereditary is that status is passed on from the mother to her children, generation after generation. Okay, this is going to be really important as we get to Thomas Jefferson defense. Now, also baptism of a child or adult does not exempt them from bondage. So being a Christian slave, not a problem for the slave owners, because they were concerned at first that if the enslaved person was baptized, they would have to free them, because why should a Christian hold another Christian in bondage? But the state, the church and state came up with an answer, a solution, and that was baptism. Now I'm going to shift your gaze. Most time historians and documentaries do not focus on this part of interracial relationship, Black men and white women. It happened more frequently than you may think, for various reasons. I won't have time to go into all the reasons why, but it happened more than you would think. As a matter of fact, the General Assembly, the Virginia General Assembly, had to spend the most time trying to control this relationship between Black men and white women versus white men and enslaved Black women, because that was a done deal. As long as she's enslaved, the Black woman, as long as she's enslaved, the father could be a free Black, he could be an Indian, he could be white, he could be an indentured servant. That child is going to be a slave. But when it comes to a white woman and a Black man, it's different. So by 1691, as you can see, that's when Virginia, now every colony was different. They have different years. But in 1691, Virginia made it illegal for intermarriage between whites and Negroes. As you can see, any white man or intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian, man or woman, they will be banished from the colonies. They will be removed forever. They won't be able to come back. And they continue to refine those laws. But there's a second part of the law. What happens to the mulatto offspring? Okay, so the next question in that law is that these bastard children, now that the marriages are no longer legal, and they were not retroactive, if they were already married prior to this law, if they already had an interracial marriage, it would remain so. But after the law is passed, by saying that interracial marriage was illegal, that meant that any child born between a Black man and a white woman in particular is going to be a servant, not a slave, a servant, and they're going to serve for 30 years. And they keep tweaking with the amount of years. Sometimes it's 30, sometimes it's 31, and so forth. But that's the punishment for the mulatto child. They will be a servant to a master. They'll be given out by a church warden. They're going to serve that person for 30 to the age of 31. There were other people who were trying to get them to serve for 31 years. And they were finagling with that. They were making them serve 31 years, not to the age of 31. So the legislators even had to come back and tweak and say, look, people, only to the age of 31. So you can imagine there was a lot of abuse with this law in terms of people trying to extract as much labor as possible from their servants. Now, here we get close to Jefferson's argument. By 1705, the capital moves from Jamestown to Williamsburg. And the legislatures, the burgesses, they must decide who can hold office and who cannot hold office. What suggests that perhaps a biracial person who others thought was white may have held office. We don't know for sure, but if you take time to read this law, it highly suggests that may have happened because of the amount of admixture that was going on. So here's the law. Who can not hold office, nor any Negro, mulatto, or Indian shall bear any office, any place of power in His Majesty's dominion. Okay, so then that raises a question. If you're going to say no Negro, mulatto, or Indian, then you need to define what a mulatto is. When is a mulatto biracial and when is a mulatto white? So you may think that in history, oh gosh, history, they're all about history. They're never involved with, I accidentally hit the thing, but they're never involved in genealogy and stuff like that. They're just involved in facts and dates. No, they had to decide who was a mulatto. By deciding who's mulatto, you decide who's white. So let's take a look. So this gives you a sense of, they said the child, grandchild, or great-grandchild. Now I'm a visual person, so I put a diagram up for you. And you can see the parents, the grandparents and the great-grandparents. That person who descends from that lineage is a mulatto. Now the question becomes, after that point, does that person become white? It's a question. Also, what is the status of that person once they have reached that level? So now they have used genealogy in the 1700s to establish who's mulatto and who's white. But that makes the white veil or the color line very vulnerable to being for people to violate it. All right, so that gave you just a little bit of the background to be able to understand this case with Thomas Jefferson. So again, it's Netherlands versus Samuel Howe. Samuel Howe is the plaintiff.
Harvey?
Yes.
Before you move into this part, would it be okay if we address some questions?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was like, oh, I hope we can get to these.
Yeah, I meant to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the questions is Yolette asks, are you going to share any information today about the worldwide culture of slavery that was endemic? And I guess she gives an example of how the Arabs were masters and experts in castrating the males for household use. Is that going to be?
Okay. I can answer your question. I didn't have enough time to get into that portion, but dealing with slavery in the East Africa that was conducted by Arabs is very contested. It's very different than in the West, and for several reasons. Sometimes if a slave that was captured converted to Islam, they could marry into the family that owned them. So Islam played a part that was very different than what you have in the West. As a matter of fact, when I went to the Historic Museum of Gorée on Gorée Island, they had an exhibit hall about the Arabs' involvement in in the East African slave trade. And it had all type of damage because I was asking my museum partner, I said, why is that? Why is the display scarred and, just being destroyed? He says, when the Arabs come in, they disagree, that they don't believe they were involved in a slave trade. It's just something, a denial. So it was different. And yes, the other difference was they were more interested in female slaves, and many of the male slaves, from boys to men, would be castrated. And there was a market, the castrated slaves were more valuable to the harems. And so they would be sold at a higher price because obviously they could not intermingle. And for some of you who are sensitive, I have to tell you this part. They were not castrated like something you might see on a veterinarian program when they're castrating bulls and so forth. They cut off all the genitalia because they wanted to make sure that that African male could not have any type of sexual relation with the female. So theirs were more extreme in certain ways, but yet if someone converted to Islam, sometimes they could become very important figures within various countries, but it's very different from, and some historians argue that perhaps Europeans learn from the East African slave trade. They may have learned a few lessons and then adjusted it for their own purpose. In the West, they were interested in African captives reproducing. In the Arab trade, they were not interested in the African men reproducing, just the African women. So that's just a short of it. So it's a difference.
Absolutely. I did not know that difference. Thank you for sharing that. I have two more if we have time for.
Okay.
One of the questions is just someone wants to know if you would agree that race is, in the consideration of skin tone, is a made-up construct. And can you share some of your thoughts on that?
I understand that a lot of people say race is a construct, and of course it was constructed by Europeans to justify the enslavement of Africans. It would eventually be used, obviously, against all indigenous people, Native Americans, and as they traveled to India and other parts of Asia, the same model would be used, or a similar model would be used. Because one of the first acts of war is you have to create an enemy. That person has to be less than human for you to either kill your enemy on a battlefield or to enslave them. So that if they're crying and showing all type of emotion, you can be distant from them, because as the enemy, just as John Newton said, as the enemy, you don't consider them. John Newton could be reading the Bible and he could hear the Africans moaning on the bottom of the ship. It's just a distance between him and the enslaved. And you also see that happen with some of the Africans who traffic some of their neighbors. Because unless you've been to Africa, you may have the notion, some people have the notion, oh, all Africans are brothers. No, no, no. They have different ethnicities. When I was there for a month, they could look at each other and they knew which ethnicity they belonged to. And that's where the loyalty lies. So if you're going to capture someone who's an enemy, you can take them and again, have the same type of distance and not care about them as humans because you have declared them as enemies. So that's an important part. So to get back to the other part of the question, is it a construct? Yes, but that's an intellectual statement. But people of African descent, at least just talking about people of African descent, have to live with the consequence of it. So whether one can have a debate as to whether it is or not, the consequence of daily life, the consequence of my daughter when she's born, if she's going to inherit the African ancestry and people looking at her, that's a consequence. That's real world.
Thank you for that. And then Harvey, if we have time for one more, there's several other things that have popped up in the chat and hopefully we can get to that later. But one more question in the Q&A for now, and then we'll move on. Negus asked, what about the 1739 Sono Rebellion and the 1740 Negro Act of South Carolina, and maybe how that affects African Americans today? Is that something that you'd be able to speak on at this moment?
Well, I can just say very quickly, because this particular, one thing about doing public history is you have to stay focused on a particular topic. I can answer many of those questions, but I can't give a presentation that covers everything because it's so vast.
True.
But the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina had more of a regional effect. There were other conspiracies that were had a broader effect on the free Black and enslaved population. So I can't really go into that further. Time is gonna, I mean, I'm keeping an odd track of the time.
I know.
But I do acknowledge your question about the Stono Rebellion. I could talk more about resistance, the Maroon societies, the independent people who live even today in Jamaica, in Colombia, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of different groups who have remained independent, others who had other forms of resistance, of course, the Haitian Revolution, but that would have to be the topic to cover. I just don't have the time today to cover it, but I thank you for bringing that up.
That does make sense. And thank you so much for taking the time to answer some of those questions. I'll pop back off and we can move back into this.
All right, so now we're going to move into the court case with Samuel Howe. So first, a little backstory for Samuel Howe. He sued his master. Again, he's a servant, has to serve 31 years. He sued him in 1764. He didn't like the lawsuit. So you know what he did? He ran away. And so by 1766, there's an ad in the paper. Mr. Wade has said, look, Samuel Howe, he's about 23 years old. He's applying for a lawyer in Williamsburg. Let me pause for a moment. Many times, certain stereotypes limit enslaved people and free Black people and their resource. It also limits them to just the Black community, whereas free Blacks and slaves had many intricate interactions with different people. How would Samuel Howe know to come to Williamsburg to look for a lawyer? There's a communication network. And you have to keep in mind, as trying to shift and broaden perspectives, if you are a servant to someone, you learn more about them, generally speaking, than they learn about you. So you can learn a lot of information by people talking. Okay, before social media, there was still the grapevine, people still talked. But he had a notion that if he found him a lawyer in Williamsburg, the capital city, that he could overturn this case. And that lawyer would be someone who just came out of law school not too long ago, Thomas Jefferson. He went to the College of William and Mary, the only college in the South before the American Revolutionary War. The College of William and Mary also owned slaves. If you go to their website, if you look up Lemon Project, it's a project or initiative that the College of William and Mary has where they address the history of slavery at that university, as many other universities across the country are doing as well. That's just how normal slavery was. It was everywhere. So he's coming to Williamsburg. He's this young attorney, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, when he's attending the College of William and Mary, he stays at the house of George Wythe. Now, George Wythe is a man of enlightenment in Williamsburg, and he's a professor of philosophy at the College of William and Mary. He's Thomas Jefferson's mentor. And so he's staying in the house with him. But just a few years later, guess what's going to happen? When Thomas Jefferson represents Samuel Howe, Mr. Netherland has the professor, George Wythe, represent him. So here's a court case of the professor and the student. And so you can imagine what that's like. You can imagine, many of you are working on your degrees, and you can imagine if you had to go head to head in a court of some type with your professor. It could be quite intimidating, but the young Thomas Jefferson, he was ready to make an argument. Now, I could go through the details, but I'm not a legal scholar, and it can be quite complicated. But just to give you an idea of what Thomas Jefferson is trying to do, just look at the genealogical chart. You see the year 1705. 1705, the grandmother, the white grandmother, she, as a result of having a mulatto child with a Negro man, her daughter as mentioned earlier, her daughter must serve 31 years as a servant, after which time, to the age of 31, she then becomes a free Black. But before she reached the age of 31, she had a son, Samuel Howell, a son with a Negro man. And so she had Samuel Howell. And now Jefferson is trying to say, hey, Samuel Howell the law of 1705 should only apply to Samuel Howell's grandmother. By 1723 and 1748, they changed the laws and said that all the children who descend from the grandmother, all the mulatto children, generation after generation, particularly if they're female, would have to be a servant for 31 years. So Jefferson is saying, just to cut to the point, he's saying like, look, you cannot retroactively make Samuel Howe, my client, a servant for 31 more years. That law only applied to his grandmother in 1705. Now, I tried to simplify that as much as possible. But what's important here is also what Jefferson said in the defense of a Black man in the year of 1770, again, in the capital of Williamsburg, a slave society that depends on slaves. Here are some of the things that Jefferson says. As I just said, he talks about the plaintiff being a mulatto of the third generation, and there being no law yet that had been made to extend it to the grandchild, which would be Samuel Howell. Okay, so hopefully you're still with me. But here's what's important in this defense. And this is why one could suggest that the free Blacks and slaves of Williamsburg, 52% of the population, they had to know about this. It's no way, Thomas Jefferson, many of these founding fathers, they grew up in the world seeing Black faces everywhere. They did not live in gated communities. They didn't live far away from Black people. They saw Black people from morning to night, from birth to death in most cases. And so here he says, for having proved that the servitude to be rightful must be founded on either a compact or a capture in war. Now, just hold on to that for a moment. I'm not going to unpack it. But when we get to the Declaration of Independence and his first draft, we're going to see similar language that he's using in 1770 to defend the plaintiff, Samuel Howell. Next, this one is, okay, this one is it's a little bit longer, but I want you to keep this in mind when you hear his draft of the Declaration of Independence. He's talked about the law of nature. And he says, under the law of nature, all men are born free. Stop. You saying that about a Black man in the year 1770 in front of the Burgesses, people that you want to be a part of, you want to be in that club, and you're saying this about a subhuman that most people think are subhuman, and you're saying all men are born free. Everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person, which includes the liberty of moving and using it at his will. He said, this is called personal liberty. Slaves don't have personal liberty, but he's saying this about a Black man. Even though this man's not a slave, he's a servant. This is still outrageous for that time period. It's radical. And he goes on to say, and is given him the author of nature, and given to him by the author of nature, meaning God. And so reducing the mother to servitude was a violation, keep track of that word, violation of the law of nature. Now you have to think about it for a moment. Today you might say, oh, no. For that time period, 1770, that was radical for this 27-year-old attorney. And word had to have spread because Samuel Howe was there. I'm sure when he left the courthouse, he told everybody. And I can suggest that a lot of Black people, free and enslaved, thought that this was their shining star. This is going to be the person. This is the generation. This guy is going to make the difference in the future of enslaved people. And let me see, I got too excited and hit the board here. So let's move on to the American Revolutionary War. And just remember some of the language I just mentioned, the violation of human nature, of natural law, I'm sorry. So we get to the American Revolution. 5,000 blacks fought for the Americans during the Revolutionary War. But let's get to Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Let's look at some of the language. He's talking about the king. This is his longest and most personal attack on the king of all 19 grievances against Great Britain. He said he has waged war, or he has waged, a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty and the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery, is a warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Now you can see that was again very radical, that young Thomas Jefferson. And they said, oh, we have to take that out because the King of England is not the only king that's profiting from the slave trade. So we're going to take that out. But again, you can see that there's a lot of hope in this young Thomas Jefferson. Now, I don't know if the free blacks and slaves knew that they were aware of what was in the first draft, but one can imagine he's a shining star for possibilities for free blacks and slaves. But then something happens. You know, we all change, we evolve. And as he becomes more of a politician, about 1781, in his notes in the state of Virginia, which he didn't publish till 85, and it was published in French, because he really didn't want people to know, at least one of the historians I talked to. And then later it's published in English. But word gets out, the shining star, the person who defended Samuel Howe, who talked about liberty. Now he's saying that the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowment of both body and mind. And this would be their color would be a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. So you can imagine that people are like, what happened? So here's Benjamin Banneker, 1791. He's writing an almanac and he wants to send it to Thomas Jefferson for him to review it. But apparently Benjamin Banneker has read the notes on the state of Virginia and he's none too happy. He said he just started, you know how sometimes you may write something and you have a moment of streaming consciousness? Well, when you read his letter, you can Google it anytime. It seems like he started writing and then the pen just kept going. And some of the things he said were very important. And you can tell because you can understand if you read between the lines. He said, sir, I hope that safely, and I hope I may safely admit in consequences that report, he's heard something, which has reached me, that you are a man less inflexible in sentiments of this nature than many others. That you are measurably friendly, well disposed towards us, and that you are willing and ready to lend your aid and assistance to our relief. So this highly suggests, as I said earlier, free blacks and slaves had more than likely been looked at Thomas Jefferson as one of the new generations who's going to change this system of slavery and free black, slavery and free blacks. So he goes on. Sir, suffer me to recall to your mind that time in which the arms and tyranny of the British crown were exerted and used in a powerful effect in order to reduce you to the state of servitude. Look back. I entreat you. So he's even asking Thomas Jefferson to look back on who he was, at least before 1789. And lastly, he says that you publicly held forth this true and invaluable doctrine. And everybody knows, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He quotes him. The black people, the free blacks and slaves, they're paying attention. They're looking to see who is the status quo and who could be that shining prince that could change this condition of slavery and denial of citizenship for free Blacks. Now, this is something that from the time of Benjamin Banneker in 1791 to Martin Luther King in 1963 in his I Have a Dream speech, he quotes the same part of the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson. But he quotes one side of Thomas Jefferson. All right, so just for the sake of understanding the makeup of Benjamin Banneker, his hereditary background, he also, very similar to Samuel Howe, his father was an African. He was enslaved to Mary Welch, who was an indentured servant. And once she became free, she freed her African slave, Banneker, and she married him. And then she had her daughter, Mary. Mary had a son with Robert, and that would be Benjamin Banneker. So again, if someone looks at your DNA, or particularly white Americans look at their DNA, depending on where your family lived in the South, certain regions of the North, you may have difficulty with it, but there are mulatto ancestries, African ancestries, and some family trees. But again, for African Americans, we're accustomed to that. All right, so in conclusion, before we get to the modern day questions, you can see that Jefferson changes from the shining light defending Samuel Howe. He took other measures to try to ease the emancipation of slaves. But if you're familiar with a person named Clay Jenkins, who does the Jefferson Hour, he believed that Jefferson changed because he knew he was not going to get far in life if he continued with his radical ways. So even Clay Jenkins believes that Jefferson started to become more status quo in order to hold office, become president, secretary of state, and so forth. Now, Martin Luther King, again, most people know him as the I Have a Dream speech, but by 67, and his speech called his last sermon that Coretta Scott King had played at his funeral, it was the Drum Major Instinct. If you have a chance to see it, I highly recommend it. And with the Drum Major Instinct, he was talking about this need that people have to feel special, like being behind that white veil, feeling more special than Native Americans, more special than African descent people, more special than any other than white. And so he says that people have a need that some people have to feel superior. It's like a high or intoxication, a need that some people have to feel that they are first and to feel that their white skin ordained them to be first. So even he addresses this question of race as he moves from the 63 more superficial, using his criticism, Martin Luther King, to a more critical Martin Luther King who's looking for answers. And he's an anti-war Martin Luther King. All of the people, the liberals who had supported him, no one was supporting him. By the time he was assassinated, he was considered irrelevant by about 70% of whites and about 50% of Blacks. And he paid a cost, he paid a price for deciding not to appeal to all, but to appeal to truth. And even though he was at odds with his fellow members as well as former supporters. All right, now with that being said, let me just get to the last part. I know I have 5 minutes. Getting back to the white veil again. I want to get to this part again, to the white veil. Today, again, let me rephrase. As I mentioned before, passing as white was one option, particularly for African Americans. They would take that secret to the grave. Their children wouldn't know. There are many books you can find about people who lived their lives as whites, and then they did their genealogy, and it was like, oh, really? Yes, they took that secret to the grave so that you would have a better life living as white, as opposed to acknowledging any African ancestry in your family line. So as you can see with the Healy family. But today, not only, I was reading an article, not only are African Americans, biracial African Americans pass for white, but even biracial people of other ethnicities can pass for white. Because passing for white, passing through the white veil just means you need to look white. You don't have to be white, totally. You can be biracial. There are Asians who can pass for white, biracial Asians, biracial people from the Middle East. There was one young lady who said when people looked at her and thought she was white, she was good with that because she didn't want to tell them that she was Muslim. So it was her way of passing so that people wouldn't engage her as a Muslim, but would engage with her as a white person. Same with Latinos, same with almost any ethnicity can pass for white. And then the other strange thing that has happened over the last few years, as I come to a conclusion and see if I can answer your questions, is particularly, as I mentioned earlier, in academia, the number of white women who have passed as Black women and engaged in, like Rachel, I can't remember Rachel's last name. She was in the NAACP, but she, people, with social media today, people can find out the background. They found out she was really a white female. There was a professor, a couple of white professors who passed as Black, a European woman. And they took advantage of the fact that within the African-American community, we have a large range of skin complexion. So if a light-skinned woman says that she's Black, you may not question that in certain cases because we're accustomed to having those ranges of color within our community. So it raises the question, there's an article that was written about the problem in academia. You've got some white women who are in academia, who are in Africana Studies program, who are passing as Black. But on the other end, you also have in social media, you have influencers, young ladies who put on makeup and so forth and get their Instagram. And there's also some of them who also, I should say, they're not trying to pass as Black as much as they're giving an image that they're ambiguous and that they could be Black. So you've got this strange mixture that's going on in society today that I'm sure some of you may be aware of it. And some of you may be a biracial person who has that ambiguity where people, many biracial people talk about how when whites think that they're white, then they drop their guard and they begin to talk about how they don't like living with Black people. They might use the N-word, or they don't want to live around Mexicans and so on and so forth. So some of you may have those stories. But again, the point is each of us is the sum total of our ancestors. And we can only see what the light reflects on our skin, our phenotypes, our hair, these features. But we can't really see who is a part of who we are. So that's something that I've got right to the end. This is the end. Questions or comments?
Yes, there are. And I want to make sure that we can get to a couple of them. Someone brought up a couple of questions here. So do you acknowledge that Africans themselves had slaves or sold tribes, people into slavery during times of starvation? Is that something that has also occurred?
Oh, it's not just times of starvation. It was, if you read a book called The Barracoon, it's the recording of one of the last slaves. Africans were brought into the country in Alabama. The last slave ship was in 1860. And there's a book called The Barracoon. And so you get a firsthand perspective. And he goes through detail of how his people were captured by the king of Benin. His people had created a sophisticated network of tunnels to defend themselves. But one of their own members became like their Benedict Arnold. He betrayed them. He didn't get I guess like a promotion or whatever. And so he went to the enemy, told them what the layout was like, what type of defenses there were, so that when the king of Benin sent his women warriors and men warriors, they knew exactly what to do to capture people as they tried to escape and defend. Now, I know there's some people who, I'm trying to be sensitive when I say this. Sometimes some African Americans may have a romantic idea of the continent of Africa and African people, but they fought each other just as much as Europeans did. Why do we have the United Nations? To keep Europeans from fighting each other. Okay. So Africans were not any different in terms of human behavior. They would fight their enemies and they would take their enemies as captives and be sold to the Americas. There's another Muslim, I can't remember his first name, Ben Sayed. He had an opportunity to go back, but he was captured during a jihad. And so he said, no, I converted to Presbyterian. I'm staying here. I'm not going back because I don't want to be enslaved again. So you have firsthand accounts from Africans. Alado Equiano, I could go on. Number of people who attest to fighting and defending themselves from other ethnic groups who had an interest in capturing slaves. Even in Ghana, they have a defense wall. This brick wall they built to defend themselves. When I was in Senegal, some people would build their houses, their communities on stilts in the water to defend themselves. So if someone was going to try to capture them, they would see them coming from a mile away and they could defend themselves. So there were different measures that various groups took to try to prevent themselves from being enslaved. And one last word, so I get to the next question, is it appears or suggests that Muslims, African Muslims were, it appears they were better able to defend their communities from being enslaved. And there's a lot more about the Africans in Islam and debating about slavery and emancipation far before abolition movement in Europe.
And then if you have time, I'd like to try to get to 2 more maybe.
Sure.
So there's more than that, but.
Okay.
Did you in your readings find that just slaves were brought here but many, many more went to India and the Middle East?
Yes, if I had used my chart, and sometimes you get different numbers from various scholars, but for the most part, from it's agreed for the most part that 12 million Africans were captured and 11 million survived the voyage across the Atlantic in the Americas. The vast majority went to Brazil, also the Spanish territories and the Caribbean. So even today, the 2 largest groups of people of African descent in the West are Brazil and Colombia. And about 3%, some say 3 to 4% of the Africans were brought here to British North America. And the significance of the Africans here compared to the others, the model of slavery here was different than in the Caribbean and in the Latin America. The model here was to encourage natural reproduction. And maybe some breeding involved, but natural reproduction. In the Caribbean, they basically would work the Africans to death, literally, because they constantly had ships coming in. So the lifespan was much shorter, and whether it was the British or the French or from the Netherlands, the Dutch, they literally had a different model. You just worked them to death because there were always fresh Africans coming in. In British North America, they wanted to limit the amount of Africans coming in because they saw how much unrest the Africans caused in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Saint Domingue. They were like, oh, well, we don't want that many. We do want some, but we don't want that many that we become the minority, as was the case in the Caribbean.
And then just in case anybody else missed this, could you please verify again, did Jefferson win the case? Someone said they didn't get to hear the result.
You're right. I'm so sorry. I got so involved. Jefferson is about 4 pages. Jefferson goes through this detail. I mean, he is just parsing words. And, I mean, he's going through. And then after Jefferson rests his case, then George Wythe, his professor and mentor, he stands up to defend his client, Wade Netherland. And the Burgesses says, he interrupts George Wythe, said, no, dismissed, abruptly dismissed. Jefferson, we don't know if again, Jefferson took some hits when he was a young guy. By 1774, 4 years later, he's not practicing law anymore. I don't know if there's a connection between the two. But yeah, they just shut him down. They just said, that's it, no, dismissed. George Wythe didn't have to say a word. It would have been interesting to see what George Wythe would have said in defense of his client.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that last bit. And then just I know you might not be able to see the chat, but so many people in the chat have said this is great information. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation. Very informative, outstanding, and just several other really great comments. I know we love having you present at the CTL. And so just so everybody knows, Harvey Bakari is coming back one more time for us in the summer. So keep an eye on when the next webinar might be. And as I've mentioned before, this is recorded. I will post it in the CTL webinar section. And we look forward to the next time. Thank you so much.